All right, I want to do a quick overview today of the public forum topic for September and October 2025, and that is, should the United Kingdom rejoin the European Union? I'm going to go very quickly over a couple of key facts that you absolutely need to know if you're going to argue this topic, and also just a couple of ideas and options for how you want to structure your case. So I think the most important thing as I'm judging these rounds is to remember that the focus needs to stay both on the United Kingdom and the European Union. Arguments that talk about larger geopolitical issues, particularly those that focus on the United States, are just a lot less relevant. I would be very clear in responding to those during clash or cross, whichever you call it, that if it's an issue regarding the United States, I would always try to bring the focus back to the United Kingdom, perhaps even reminding my opponent that you would agree with me that this prompt is about the UK and the EU, correct? And that issues that are tangential to that regarding the United States are of less importance. I would do that because it's important to continue to ground the argument in that way and frame it. I think if you allow the opposing team to restructure their argument outside of that framework, you're going to do yourself a disservice. And frankly, you're also going to do your opponents a disservice because that's not what the topic is about. The other thing that I would be very, very cautious of, especially if I am the affirmative or the pro in this case, is you don't want to relitigate Brexit. That's not what the prompt is. And especially if you're negation, if you want to do that, that's fine. But if you're affirmative, you don't want to let the negation bait you in to relitigating Brexit. That would be pointless, right? Because we already know what happened. The UK did leave the European Union in 2020 after voting to do so in 2016 and then having a protracted period of negotiations. So it'd be pointless to debate that topic because we already know what happened. So if the negation gets to structure this as a Brexit relitigation, they're going to win. And that's because we know what happened. So you need to make sure that you're consistently reframing the argument to stay away from that. Okay. Now, one of the things that you need to really understand if you're going to debate this topic is the different ways in which the European Union functions vis-a-vis sovereignty. So, the European Union, like the UN, for example, is a supranational organization. So, anytime you join a supranational organization, a state must give up a percentage of its sovereignty. Sovereignty is the ability to exercise power within a given region. So, if the United Kingdom has sovereignty within its territories, total sovereignty, then that means it can set all of its laws and policy. Usually we use the phrase policy rather than law because you can have domestic policy, you can have foreign policy, you can have economic policy, you can have all of those sorts of things, all right? But there's a couple of things you need to understand about the EU. The EU actually has three levels of sovereignty, all right? So it has exclusive, shared, and supporting competencies. An example of an exclusive competency, that is a situation in which the EU actually has power over its constituents. All right. So think of the countries, the 27 countries who are in the EU right now. You're probably thinking of France, Great Britain, might also think of Spain, Italy, so on and so forth. All right. If the EU has an exclusive competency in an area, and you want to think of the big ones like this, the biggest is trade. All right. Then individual member states are actually not free to set their own policy in that way. That's important to remember, particularly because if you think about a great example for this right now is the tariff agreement with the United States. Italy did not set its own tariff agreement with the United States. Neither did France. Okay. The European Union set it because that's an exclusive competency. Now, a shared competency is a great example of when the EU actually is in a power sharing agreement with the member state. Perfect example here is if you want to talk about policing. Certainly, the EU has aspects of its policy where there's information sharing, for example, about the movement of dangerous persons or suspected persons, and that's actually a benefit if you're arguing pro or AF in this case. The fact that the United Kingdom could get access to those resources is actually really helpful. That being said, of course, it's up to still every individual country, every single member state, to actually execute that policy because the EU doesn't have police officers of its own. So that's a great example of a shared competency. When you talk about a supporting competency, you're talking about something now where the country itself has the vast majority of the power in a given situation, and the EU is just trying to help that. Defense is probably the best example of this right now because there's still discussions in the EU about how the member states should be responding to Russian aggression. Right now, when we talk about EU defense, we're really only talking about a supporting competency, the way in which the infrastructure of the EU itself might support its member states in responding to Russian aggression or any aggression to that matter. All right. Now, it's not as firm as NATO. In NATO, you have an attack against one is an attack against all. That's Article 5. There's no such article in the EU. That's what makes it a supporting competency as opposed to an exclusive competency. I would recommend digging more into this issue because it actually helps you understand a lot more what some of the objections of the negation argument are going to be and how you can best respond to them. All right, so let's talk about economic factors. And I think that these are kind of important things to think about, especially because a lot of this argument is going to come down to economics and the plus and minuses of both sides. Again, it's critical to understand it's not a relitigation of Brexit, but if you're looking for facts in the specific case, you really do want to focus on the time between the vote, so 2016, and today, 2025, and particularly the period after which the UK actually did leave the EU. That was in 2020. All right. So between 2020 and 2025, we have our best evidence as to how the financial arrangements have actually impacted the UK and the EU to that matter. Now, of course, you definitely want to argue, especially if you're the negation, that you've got some intervening factors in there, particularly COVID, that change the way in which these things are structured and they work. All right. But it's a weighing situation. Okay. When it comes to the economic pluses and minuses, on the pro EU side, you've got the arguments, if you're going to rejoin the European Union, that tariffs or trade boundaries with the European Union have cut off the United Kingdom's access to its biggest trading partners for a lot of its institutions. And in particular, if you look at small businesses, that's been the case. The EU is famous for red tape. And being outside of the EU doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with that red tape. In fact, it's actually significantly worse. So that argument definitely cuts in the favor of the AF on this one. On the other hand, if you want to look at negation issues on economy, you're really looking at budgetary autonomy, the ability of the United Kingdom to be able to set its own economic policies. That would be a shared competency and an exclusive competency if you think about the euro and monetary policy. So the EU would lose its ability to be autonomous in a lot of different ways if it were to rejoin the European Union. The question is, who is better off in each scenario? That brings us to opt-outs. You have to understand what opt-outs are. Sometimes these are also called carve-outs. These are parts of an EU exclusive competency that did not apply to the United Kingdom the first time around. Now, there's going to be a lot of debate over these issues because, of course, the affirmative is going to argue that, well, the UK got these opt-outs the first time around, so why wouldn't they get them the second time around? If you're negation, you definitely want to argue just because they got them the first time around doesn't mean there's a guarantee they will get them the second time around. And that concern in and of itself, that unknown, could be a major factor that precludes many people who live in the UK from wanting to rejoin the EU. All right. So what were the two opt-outs in this case, or carve-outs? The euro and what's called the Schengen area. So the euro, if you've ever been to Europe, you can go from Italy to France to Spain, and you don't have to change your money because all of them use the euro. Even when the United Kingdom was a member of the EU, they did not use the euro as their currency. They continued to use the pound. If the UK rejoins the European Union and is not allowed a carve out for the pound, the percentage of support that drops among the British population for rejoining the EU plummets to 36%. Okay, that's way less than actually voted to stay in the European Union the first time around. And so that is a critical issue to understanding. The other is the Schengen area. That's within the 27 member states of the European Union. Again, if you've ever been to Europe, you'll know that you can pass from one EU country to the next, and you don't necessarily have to show your passport. And so there's a freedom of movement clause. The United Kingdom also got an opt-out for that in the first time around. And again, if you're affirmative, you want to argue that they'll probably get that again because they got it the first time. If you're negation, you want to argue that there's no guarantee they'll get it, and that drives down support in the United Kingdom. It also would take away their autonomy to set their own immigration policies, though those cut both ways. I do want to point out a really important fact here from some rounds that I've already heard, and that is that opt outs must be negotiated as part of an admission to the EU. So you can't today, if you're a member of the EU, let's say France today can't say, well, we're not going to accept the euro anymore. That's part of membership. Carve outs have to be negotiated going in, so it's part of the process. It is also important to understand there is technically no such thing as a readmission process. There's no such thing as rejoining the European Union. There's an admissions process, so there's just joining the European Union, but you have to start from square one. The UK would be starting at the exact same footing as Turkey or Ukraine or anyone else who wants to join the EU. They don't get special privileges. So, what are our key affirmative points in this case? Well, a lot of time you want to spend talking about the economy. The red tape is massive because they have to deal with the EU from the outside looking in. UK businesses in general have to deal with between 200 to 250 million documents just to sell their goods in the EU. This is particularly damaging to small businesses, and there's a lot of good cards about this. Household budgets have increased since the UK has left the EU. And you can argue part of that's about COVID, but it is nevertheless something that you want to bring up. You also want to bring up the devolved parliaments. Let me talk about the devolved parliaments for a second. So, the UK is what's called a unitary state, which means it doesn't have states like the United States does or Mexico. All right. All policy comes from Westminster. So, all policy comes from Parliament, which sits in London. However, what the UK has done, and remember, the UK is made up of 4 different countries: Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And what it has done over the past 10 years is it has devolved. It has given power to 2 principally of those regions, Scotland and Northern Ireland, to set their own policy and their own affairs. And that has worked really effectively for them. However, the devolved parliaments of Scotland and Northern Ireland did not want to leave the European Union. In fact, the vote in Northern Ireland and the vote in Scotland was decisively in favor of staying in the European Union. And you want to remember that because, particularly if you are the affirmative, what you can argue is that if you continue to reject reunification with the EU, you could risk Scotland and Northern Ireland declaring independence and voting independence entirely. And Scotland did vote for independence in 2017. It didn't go through, but they voted in the aftermath of this. And there's no saying that they won't do so again. The last arguments that I think are really effective are the moral arguments, which is in particular migration and policing. Yes, in the aftermath of Brexit, the United Kingdom has gotten more autonomy over its immigration policies and how it executes policing. However, hasn't used those policies technically always for the best from a moral and certainly from an international lens, as its schemes to deport people to Rwanda will quickly show. Now let's talk about the negation. And the first is politics. The biggest argument here that you need to advance if you're negation is that none of the affirmatives points are worth the domestic discontent that reunification would bring. You have to remember that even if the UK votes tomorrow to become part of the EU, that process is likely to take 7 to 10 years for negotiation. And in that intervening period, you have to argue it's not worth the domestic unrest and discontent that this would bring. Even if you believe the polling right now, and we're sitting at about 60% in favor of reunification with the EU, that still leaves a huge chunk of the population that does not want to reunify with the EU. And how are you going to deal with their anger and discontent, particularly with the rise of Reform UK, which is a populist right-wing nationalist party? You might only stoke the fires of that party by trying to reunify. And I would raise that argument again and again in a way to undercut the arguments that the app is making. And then, of course, there's the long shadow of Brexit. Do you really want to flip flop over and over again? How many times are you going to go back and forth between the UK being its independent nation state and it being part of the EU? Every time you do that, you introduce uncertainty. And that uncertainty is bad for business and bad for domestic politics. In fact, it's bad for everything. There's no scenario where uncertainty is good, and I would hit that. Economics also cut both ways. Like I said, you want to be consistent. There's a trade-off with the Indo-Pacific that you're going to hear this one a lot, the CPTPP. All right. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that the UK recently signed with a variety of Indo-Pacific states. And those trade agreements are worth something, but there's a question that would the UK have to give those up if they rejoin the European Union, since the EU has an exclusive competency over trade? Maybe they wouldn't, but the argument that they would is still a good one. The best argument is that onshoring is just simply superior. Onshoring is trying to keep your supply chains in the United Kingdom itself. As we learned during COVID, the more international your supply chains are, the more vulnerable they are to disruption. And you want to hit that argument pretty hard as best you can. But I do want to make an argument, an overall statement about the value of argumentation here. I always say, imagine an argument like a chain. Every link in the chain is a part of it. You don't have to attack every link, you just have to break one. This is particularly important for people who are going to spread, which I don't recommend in PF because it's not in the spirit of the competition. But if somebody does choose to do that and they're going to argue about, oh, the impacts of the UK rejoining the EU on the United States and then vis-a-vis their conflict with China, you don't have to talk about the conflict with China at all. You don't have to talk about the United States. I would just go right back to the argument of what the heck does this have to do with the United Kingdom rejoining the EU? You can attack that initial link of that chain to argue that the UK rejoining the EU or not rejoining the EU is not going to have a substantive impact on United States foreign relations with China or nuclear war or famine in Africa or the complete takeover of AI of the world or any of the other myriad weird arguments that I've heard so far. All right. You want to stay grounded in the UK to the EU, and I would make sure that you attack that first link if that's something that you think is valuable.